All right, so today we'll look at connective tissue. Look at types of connective tissue. Types of connective tissue. Last time we're looking at the properties of connective tissue. This time around, we'll now look at the types of connective tissue. So connective tissue in general, we have loose and dense connective tissue. So we have connective tissue proper. This is loose and dense. Then we have connective tissue with special properties. This is connective tissue that is specialized to perform certain function in the body. Example given is cartilage, bone, and blood. Cartilage, bone, and blood. Those are connective tissue, but you see that they have specific function in the body. Example given, the bone is forming the framework of the body. Then cartilage is found in special parts of the skeleton, for example, joints. We also have cartilage in the epiglottis, so we have different types of cartilage. Then blood is also a connective tissue connecting various organ systems because it is transporting useful elements. Example given is gases and various types of nutrients. So today's discussion will focus on connective tissue proper, which is broken down into loose and dense connective tissue. So in front of our screen here is the skin. The skin is made up of 3 layers. These layers are distinct from one another. From here to there is epidermis, followed by dermis from there up to somewhere here. Then down there we have the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. So we see that this epidermis is composed of epithelial tissue, whereas the dermis and the hypodermis is composed of connective tissue. So the top layer is epithelial tissue, followed by connective tissue. So this connective tissue in the dermis and connective tissue in the hypodermis are of different types, but they fall under the broad category of connective tissue. So here is a summary of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper, which is composed of loose connective tissue, otherwise known as areolar connective tissue. Suffice to say, this is the most abundant type of connective tissue in the body, found in almost all body parts and organs. Then dense connective tissue is broken down into 2 parts. We have dense irregular connective tissue and dense regular connective tissue. Then we have what we call embryonic connective tissue, found in embryos, meaning this is a developing human body, which later develops into the fetus. So it begins as a zygote. Zygote turns into a morula. Morula turns into a brastomere. A brastomere implants into the uterus, then is transformed into an embryo. The embryo is later transformed into a fetus. Then fetus is born as a human being. So the type of connective tissue that is present in the embryo, we call it embryonic connective tissue. They are of 2 types, mesenchyme and mucoid. We'll look at them much later on. Then finally, we finish with specialized connective tissue, like I said earlier on. So today's focus is on these types from connective tissue proper. Then we'll throw in embryonic connective tissue. So we'll end here. Then this will be covered in another session. So without wasting time, we'll begin with loose connective tissue, otherwise known as areolar connective tissue. Suffice to say, this is the most common type of connective tissue. This connective tissue is loose because the cells of this connective tissue are, number 1, not tightly held together like we saw in epithelial tissue. The cells are wide apart. Okay, so this is consistent for all connective tissue. Cells are distant from one another. Apart from that, loose connective tissue is termed as such because it has less fibers in it, that is comparison to other types of connective tissue. Loose connective tissue has less fibers, that is collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. Then it has less ground substance. I explained last time what ground substance was, which is the part of the extracellular matrix of connective tissue. So that being said, loose connective tissue has more cells, less fibers, and less ground substance. It is found in all small blood vessels. You know, blood vessels have the ability to expand when the heart is beating during systolic, phase, and also constrict when the heart is in the diastolic phase. That ability to recoil and expand is as a result of loose connective tissue found in blood vessel, the tunica media and the tunica externa. Okay. Apart from that, loose connective tissue fills up spaces in between muscles and nerve fibers. Then specifically in epithelial tissue, we said epithelial tissue rests on a basement membrane. So that basement membrane, we also refer to it as lamina propria. Now, lamina propria is loose connective tissue. So we should take note of that. The lamina propria that we found in epithelial tissue is formed by loose connective tissue. So this is what we have here. This is a skin. That is a dermis, the epidermis. Epidermis from here up to there. Then the following layer is loose connective tissue. So that is loose connective tissue. What we are seeing here are nucleus or nuclei, because they are multiple. 1, 2, 3. These are nuclei of cells of connective tissue. To be specific, these are fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are cells of connective tissue. You have to check in part 1, connective tissue, about those cells. So these are fibroblasts. Then what you are seeing there, more like lines, are collagen, reticular, and elastic fibers. The two, elastic and reticular fibers, are not so visible, except the collagen, which are the largest fibers. So that's about loose connective tissue. Its major function is found in spaces left by muscles, nerve fibers, and the rest. And is found in all organs of the body. If you look at the eye, at the back of the eye, there's fat there. That fat is loose connective tissue. Okay. Let's look at dense connective tissue. What are we expecting to see here? Dense, the name comes from the proportion of fibers found in this type of connective tissue. So under loose, we're saying there are more cells, less fibers, and less ground substance. But when it comes to dense connective tissue are of two types, irregular and regular. Regardless of the two, dense connective tissue is composed of few cells this time, more fibers, that is collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers, and little or no ground substance. So in dense connective tissue, most likely you will not find ground substance. It is limited in terms of amount as compared to loose connective tissue. Okay, where do we find such kind of structure? Okay, so now let's break down first dense irregular and irregular. Why the two names? It's because of the orientation of the collagen fibers. The collagen fibers are the most abundant fibers of connective tissue. So dense connective tissue can be termed as dense irregular or dense regular. We can call it dense regular if the collagen fibers are moving in the same direction. Now here we see like waves. These should be red or pink. I don't know the color here. I think it's pink. These pink fibers, these are collagen fibers we are seeing. Then the dark spots, these are nucleus or fibroblasts. So we can see that the fibers are not in the same direction. Some fibers are going circle like this, others are in that plane, and the rest. So we call this as dense irregular. Where do we find dense irregular? Dense irregular is found in outer covering of all internal organs. If you check the liver is shiny on the surface because it has a capsule. The kidney has a capsule. The spleen has a capsule. This is the outer covering connective tissue formed by dense irregular connective tissue. Then what about dense regular? Dense regular mainly forms tendons and ligaments. Why do we call it dense regular? It's because the direction of the fibers is in one direction. So here you see that the direction of the fibers are going in almost the same direction. But if you check this one, fibers, these are going like that. Observe this, turning back, that making a C shape. So we call this as irregular, where we call this one as regular. But at the end of the day, they are both dense connective tissue. And therefore, between the two, dense regular connective tissue forms the toughest type of connective tissue, which is tendons and ligaments. If you check these structures, they are very strong. Tendons attach muscles to the skeleton, whereas ligaments attach bones to bones. And therefore, we need strong structures there. But dense irregular, of course, it is tough, but not as tough as tendons. If you check the outer covering of the liver, you can tear it up. Same with the outer covering of the kidneys, the spleen, and the likes. That is dense irregular. So all internal organs are covered by dense irregular. Tendons and ligaments formed by dense regular. So both are fibroblasts. Fibroblasts, fibroblasts. Fibroblasts, fibroblasts. These are fibroblasts. Okay. All right. Let's look at specialized connective tissue. So here now we'll look at reticular tissue. Reticular tissue, we call it reticular because it is formed mainly by collagen type 3. So we call this as reticular fibers. And therefore, the type of tissue it forms is reticular tissue. Where do we find this? So reticular tissue forms the framework or the meshwork in which cells of internal organs are occupied. So if you look at the liver, the spleen, the kidneys, and the likes, they have the outer covering, of course, by dense irregular. Now, the actual cells of that organ are well arranged because they sit on these reticular fibers or reticular tissue. Now, think of reticular tissue like a net or a sieve, urupe, the one we use for sieving millet and other things. Now, not urupe, but sefa. Yeah, sefa. Yeah, so a sieve or a net. Now, a net has those pores, like a mosquito net, has those pores, small, tiny pores, and the cotton, weaving. So that's how reticular fiber, reticular tissue appears. It forms that weaving that will allow cells to sit in those spaces so that an organ is formed. And therefore, the skeleton of all internal organs is reticular tissue. You find this in the liver, you find this in the spleen, you find this in the pancreas, kidneys, and all those small, soft internal organs. What about mucoid connective tissue? Remember, mucoid connective tissue, we said this is found in the embryo when it's not yet even developed into a fetus, because we call a fetus when you see body parts. Before you start seeing any body parts, you call that as an embryo. Usually it just appears like a toad. Okay, when the frog is forming, you can see something like a head and something like a tail, and the mid part, which is the body. At that stage is still an embryo. Okay. And in the early stages of a fetus. When the fetus is forming now, you see to my hands, the legs, like a face forming, that is a fetus now. So mucoid connective tissue, otherwise known as mucous connective tissue, this is only found specifically in the fetus. Now, in the fetus, we have, or in the embryo, so in the embryo, then develops into a fetus. So when the embryo is converted into a fetus, the part of the fetus that will only have mucoid connective tissue is in the umbilical cord. The rest of the body is now transformed into body parts. So the umbilical cord has 3 vessels. That is 1 artery and 2 veins. Now, these 3 structures are within the cord, and this cord has a fluid, a jelly-like substance that is known as Wharton's jelly. So Wharton's jelly is simply mucoid connective tissue. Okay, and once a fetus is born, then we no longer have any mucoid connective tissue in the body. Okay, now the only part in an adult where you can find mucoid connective tissue is the intervertebral disc. The intervertebral disc shown here, this is a vertebral bone. Then this is a cartilage connecting this bone to that one. So this part of the cartilage has 2 parts. The intervertebral disc has 2 parts. The central part, which we call the nucleus pulposus, and the peripheral part, which we call the annulus fibrosus. So the only part in adults where you can find mucoid connective tissue is the nucleus pulposus of the intervertebral disc. Intervertebral disc, nucleus pulposa. That's where you find mucoid connective tissue. Where else is in the umbilical cord? In the umbilical cord, the fluid that is protecting or giving nourishment to these 3 blood vessels, 2 veins, 1 artery, is Wharton's jelly. And that is mucoid connective tissue. I hope that is clear. So that's how mucoid connective tissue appears. It differs from loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue because of the following. Mucoid connective tissue has less cells, number 1, less or no fibers, and abundant ground substance. So this time, in mucoid connective tissue, we have more ground substance than cells and than fibers. That's the special property of mucoid connective tissue. More ground substance. A few cells, a few fibers, like we can see here in pink. That's how it appears under a microscope. Another special type of connective tissue is adipose tissue. Now, adipose tissue is part of loose connective tissue. Remember, loose connective tissue, we're saying there will be more cells, less fibers, and less ground substance. So this tissue is composed mainly of fat cells, which we call adipocytes. So these adipocytes make up the majority of adipose tissue, hence the name adipose. Okay, I explained the function of these cells in the previous session about connective tissue. Now let's take it a bit further here. Now, these cells are fat cells because they store fat in their cytoplasm, and fat is essential for metabolism in the body. We store fat as a form of energy reserve. So the more fat you have in your body, it means the more unused energy you have in the body, and that unused energy becomes disease. If it keeps piling, it has to be bent, it has to be used. That's why it's not advisable that your weight goes beyond what is equivalent with your height, the BMI. Then you are either overweight or obese because of excess unused energy in the body in form of fat. So what you're seeing here in front of our screen is fat cell under electron microscope. That's a cell. Now I said this cell accumulates fat, and therefore the nucleus and other organelles are pushed to one side. This is what we are seeing here. Nucleus plus some other organelles. Even nucleus is not visible in some of these cells. So these are organelles. That's a nucleus full of fat. Now we are saying when it comes to adipose tissue, there are 2 types of adipose tissue in the human body. We have brown and white adipose tissue. Brown and white. The commonest type of adipose tissue is white, or white fat if you like. Now, white fat is adult fat, if I may use that term. But in a newborn baby, of course, they will have some white adipose. They will also have brown adipose, otherwise known as thermogenin. So this is the most useful type of adipose tissue to the newborn baby. This is not useful to adults, as you will see in a short space. So this is white fat, which all of us have under the skin, more in females. Males have less subcutaneous layer than females. Of course, that is influenced by the hormones. That is a sexual hormone, testosterone and estrogen, progesterone. That's why we have those variations. Let's begin with white fat. What's the difference? There's a diagram that I like to use here, this one. Now, let's observe that the origin of adipose tissue is the same. They all come from what we call mesenchymal cells. Mesenchymal cells are simply stem cells. These are cells that can multiply and divide into any other type of cell in the body. In short, these cells can replace adult cells. So at this stage, they have not yet decided what they want to be. So mesenchymal cells will give us two types of cells. They can give us fibroblasts. They can also give us adipocytes or pre-adipocyte. Now, pre-adipocyte will be converted into brown adipose and white adipose. So let's forget about fibroblast. This cell can also give us fat cell. Now, brown adipose and white adipose, where is the major difference? The major difference is this. Brown adipose, in terms of storage of fat, both cells store fat. Even though we are calling it brown and white, what is inside there is just fat. Now, brown adipose cells are known as multilocular adipocytes, whereas white adipose cells are known as unilocular adipocyte. Locus means position. One position, multiple position. So if you observe these two cells, they are different. This is a nucleus, that is a nucleus. Now, brown adipose, instead of storing fat as a single droplet, it stores fat as multiple droplets. So you see these, several of them filling up the cytoplasm. Whereas white adipocytes store fat as a single droplet. Single droplet, multiple droplets. So, for example, in terms of amount of fat it can store, is equivalent, it's the same. Let's say we put liters. If this is storing 20 liters, expect this to store also 20 liters, except here we have a single bucket. There we have maybe 5 liters containers, 4 of them. Still is going to give us 20 liters. That's a major difference. This one stores fat as multiple droplets. That is brown adipose. White adipose stores fat as a single droplet. Now, because of these differences, when it comes to metabolism, when the body wants to use fat to produce energy, when the body breaks down brown adipose will give us more heat and less energy, whereas white adipose will give us more energy but less heat. And that's why brown adipose is useful in newborn babies, because newborn babies need heat, and they can get that heat from brown adipose instead of white. But adults, the skin is developed, we're able to take care of ourselves when it's cold. And therefore, that stage, we don't need brown adipose. We need white adipose that can give us energy. That's the difference. So in terms of heat production, we are looking at brown adipose. White adipose gives us energy. I hope we have gotten the difference there. Right. Next thing we'll look at now is cartilage. Okay. So cartilage, we'll do another session separate. For now, we're focusing on connective tissue. So that's about connective tissue proper. We've talked about connective tissue proper, which is loose connective tissue. We also talked about dense connective tissue. There are two types, dense regular and dense regular. Dense regular forming stronger structures like tendons and ligaments. Dense irregular covering outer covers of all internal organs. Okay, then we have other special type of connective tissue, for example, reticular connective tissue, giving us the framework of internal organs. Mucoid connective tissue. This is embryonic connective tissue found specifically in the embryo. But we're saying in adults, it can be found in the nucleus pulposus. In adults, found in the nucleus pulposus. In the fetus or newborn baby, it is part of the umbilical cord as Wharton's jelly. Then we have now finally talked about types of adipose tissue, which is brown and white adipose. So this is found all over the skin, white adipose. Now, when a newborn baby is born, if you observe the thighs, the back of the shoulder girdle there on the shoulders, the neck, this is the areas where brown adipose is found. But as we grow, it disappears. Okay, so the only part in an adult where you can find brown adipose is around the kidneys. So kidneys, both left and right kidney, are surrounded with brown adipose tissue. That is to keep the kidneys warm and prevent them from damage in cases of, hypothermia. Apart from that, around the kidneys, this brown adipose acts as a protective barrier. Okay, that's why if you lose so much weight, this brown adipose tissue disappears from around the kidneys. And during that time, the kidneys are vulnerable to injury in case someone falls on the lateral side of the body or someone is punched in the rib cage, especially for boxers, and that can cause potential damage to the kidneys. And that's why I actually don't even allow boxers of different weight to fight, because weight plus the force of the punch, that can cause injury to some of these organs of the body. So that's it about connective tissue proper. Next time, we'll talk about cartilage. Okay.